Morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And I'm really delighted today to be joined by a terrific author and teacher and wise man in the United States, Frank Gavin, who is a president at the, excuse me, who is a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He also directs the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs, which is also at SAIS. Let me tell you a little bit about Frank. He grew up in Philadelphia. He earned an undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Chicago, a master's in modern history from Oxford University, and a doctorate in history from the University of Pennsylvania. He's had an amazing academic career, taught at MIT, where, among other things, directed the Nuclear Security Studies program, taught at the University of Texas, and now is at SAIS, Johns Hopkins. Is a terrific teacher, an amazing writer in a wide array of topics, fun, probing, interesting. He has just come out with a book that is published by Yale University Press, was released earlier this month. It's called Thinking Historically: A Guide to Statecraft and Strategy. Again, published by Yale University Press just in early September. Frank is joining us from his home in Washington, D.C. I was teasing him, it looks like Aspen, but he's assured me that it is actually Washington, D.C. So, Frank, good morning.
Good morning to you, and thank you for that overly generous introduction. I feel like, my head is spinning. It's just lovely. Thank you. And it's
Good.
great to
I
be
think I
here.
almost slipped the word president in when I meant
Yeah,
professor, but either way. Well, Frank, as I mentioned, you grew up in Philadelphia, and in one of your writings, you said there were no scholars in the extended Gavin McBride clan, nor did anyone know any academics. Informing my family that I hoped to quarterback the Philadelphia Eagles would have made more sense and seemed more plausible than becoming a professor. Talk about growing up in Philadelphia, your family, and just sort of the influence they had in shaping your worldview.
sure, sure. That's a wonderful, wonderful story. Yeah, I grew up in a kind of your classic Irish Catholic Philadelphia middle class family. My dad was the youngest of 10, the first to go to college. All of his brothers were either policemen or postal workers. He was the first to go to college. And so, I hadn't thought about this story in a while, but an uncle that I was very, very close to, who had been a mailman and had been single, he'd passed away and he left some money to each of his nephews and nieces, and my parents decided to send me to a private Catholic high school, LaSalle College High School, and with Christian brothers, and there sort of had some amazing history teachers. Had a AP European history teacher, brother Frank Downialski, I haven't thought about in years, and just kind of fired my love of history. We read the famous R.R. Palmer and Colton, world history book, marked it all up, and then decided to go to the University of Chicago. I basically, when you went to LaSalle, you were supposed to go to a Big Five school: St. Joe's, LaSalle, Villanova. In fact, they would bring everyone, all the top performers, in a room and say, okay, you've all got scholarships to LaSalle. And many of us said we wanted to avoid that. And so I had read Free to Choose by Milton Friedman and around this time, and became sort of obsessed with the University of Chicago, applied there, went, got in, and then had University of Chicago just like opened my eyes to this completely different world. And there was a whole process of things from that point on. Became a research assistant to John Mearsheimer in his younger period. Got to see what a professor did up close, and I just sort of fell in love with the sort of academic life.
Well, Frank, in one writing, you talk about a professor who was very influential, a gentleman by the name of Carl Weintraub, and you described him as a, quote, intimidating, even terrifying presence. You talk about a Western Civ class you took, which you said extended for 2.5 millennia, while focusing on facts as narrow as the milk production of a typical 12th century cow. Talk about, but you said, but his class is why I became a professor. Talk about the professor, if you would.
Professor Weintraub was an extraordinary figure, and the University of Chicago is kind of a fun, eclectic place. And I've been taking my youngest daughter on college trips lately, and we did get to see all the amazing universities in the United States. She's a senior in high school, and we went back to the University of Chicago, and it's actually extraordinary how similar it is to 40 years ago when I went. It's actually remarkable. And Carl Weintraub had been I think he was half German, half Dutch. He was Jewish, and during World War II, had had to hide in an attic, and came to the United States, studied undergraduate and PhD at University of Chicago. It's one of these kind of classic, severe, serious academics with a pipe. And he would, at Chicago had this tradition where to get the best classes, you had to sleep out the night before for registration. There were a few classes. There was this wonderful class on Shakespeare taught by David Bevington, but the class that was most prized was Carl Weintraub's History of Western Civilization. 3 quarters. You actually, in addition to the normal 3 hours a week of class, he would do a Wednesday evening lecture. And I remember he would pace the hallways with his pipe. And so during the class time, he would teach Socratic method based on documents. No one ever got anything right. We'd just always be frustrated by how slow he thought we all were. And then he would give these majestic Wednesday night lectures. And I mentioned in that essay one that's always stood with me, one about Erasmus and this figure of toleration. But he was just this extraordinary teacher. And the dorm I was in, we got to invite professors to come to various sherry hours. And I remember I nervously invited him. And he basically claimed that he was just a big teddy bear. He didn't understand why people were so terrified of him. And he was this brilliant, intimidating character who was devoted to his students and teaching the Socratic method and wrestling with primary sources and original texts. And it was just an extraordinary experience. And the kind of class that I don't think we see as much anymore, and we definitely miss.
Well, Frank, in another essay, you say, I love being a professor. I am beyond grateful to live in a world that allows me to read, think, write, and teach young people. I have spent much of my adult life in universities and will continue to I will continue to be there until they drag me from the classroom. It has been a wonderful adventure. What is it about teaching that most excites you and interests you and animates you?
So I think it's the smart, young, curious people that you get to interact with. One of my pet peeves about fellow academics is they'll often complain about students, or they'll complain that, well, back in my day, every year that goes by, the students are smarter, more interesting, more curious, more capable, and just the kind of energy that comes from teaching them. And I'll tell you, the sort of the life of being a professor, the idea that I get paid to read, to think, to write, to engage with these smart young people. It's just I can't imagine a different life. And I'm getting at the age where some of my friends start talking about the retirement plans. And I have two models in mind. When I was at the University of Texas, Elspeth Rostow had the office next door to me, and she had been dean of the school and a great teacher. And she was married to Walt Rostow, the former national security advisor. And Walt passed away in the middle of a semester. We went over, I had to take over his class. And on his desk was a letter to Colin Powell about how to solve the crisis in the Middle East, an unfinished book manuscript, and a class. So Elspeth, who was always the organized one, she ended up about 5 years later, she was 90 years old, finished her class on a Wednesday, got her grades in on Friday, hosted a holiday party Friday evening, and passed away the next day. And to me, it was like, well, she got her grades in and then passed. And so for me, there's something about that. Henry Kissinger finished his last book manuscript the day before he died. He finished the last sort of words on it. And there's something about the life of an academic that it's more of a vocation than to me than a job. And so I just feel very, very lucky that I get to do this.
Frank, talk a little bit, if you would, about the Kissinger Center, which you run. In your welcoming letter, you say our mission is to generate and apply rigorous historical thinking to the most vexing global challenges. Tell a little bit of the backstory of the center, and then did you actually have an interview with Dr. Kissinger before getting the position?
So I've got a great story on that front. But the first thing that happened, I'd been at University of Texas for 13 years. I'd loved it. I was at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, helped create two centers there, the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law and the Clements Center for National Security. But there was MIT has the security studies program, and over the years had met lots of faculty and grad students from there that I just thought were super smart, but they were political scientists. But I thought this would be wonderful. They recruited me for this chair. They had nuclear security. And I went and I was a member of a political science department. And one of the things that I think you see when you read some of my more personal essays is that I'm a historian, but I'm close to political scientists, and I've always had this sort of torn identity. The honest truth is that more political scientists read me. I've been in political science departments. I've never been in a history department. The field of history has its own pathologies and problems that are heartbreaking and tragic to me. But at the end of the day, I have the soul of a historian. So when I went to MIT, I loved the graduate students, but I just saw that I was kind of a luxury item. Um, the historian who sort of added a little bit of an amuse-bouche after people took their quantitative methods classes or their IR theory classes, which were really the core of what they were doing. And I never thought I would leave because I loved MIT, but I got a call from uh, the dean of the sites at the time, Vali Nasser, and he said, "We're creating this center in honor of Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger really wants historians. And we're going to hire a bunch of historians." I said, "That's terrific. I want to support you, but I'm not leaving MIT." And Vali kept at it. And then finally he said, "Well, how are you going to run this center?" He's like, "Well, we're going to bring a bunch of historians together and they'll figure it out." I said, "That's the stupidest idea I've ever heard in my life. When have you ever thought historians have ever been able to organize anything?" I said, "I want to see this succeed. If you want me to come in and help run it, I could be interested." And so he said, "Okay." So we came in and we've had great historians, Mary Sarati, Hal Brand, Sergei Rodchenko. And so the thing that appealed to me was that when they asked Kissinger, "What do you want this to be?" he said, "The application of history to problems of statecraft and strategy." And I thought, that's exactly what I've been trying to do my whole career. It's what I believe in. So in terms of meeting Dr. Kissinger, Hopkins is very good at keeping donors separate from any academic stuff. So the real funder of this is Mike Bloomberg. He's been very, very generous, but they don't get any say in the academic decisions. That being said, I got the position and I went up to meet with Dr. Kissinger in October of 2016 and go to his office at 350 Park in Manhattan. I sit down and he says, "Frank, I have never heard of you. How do I know that you won't take this money and pursue woke initiatives and things that are at odds with my career and background?" I said, "Dr. Kissinger, here's the good news. I have tenure. So as you know, that means I can do whatever I want and you can't do anything about it. On the other hand, if I get fired because I pissed off Henry Kissinger, I'd be a legend. So I win either way. You just have to trust me." And he laughed so much that at that point we got along great. And I would go up there to visit him about every 6 weeks or 2 months. And I made it very clear that we loved his participation in the center, but I was not going to. There were every once in a while he would try to sneak in one of his old friends in a sinecure, and I would have to fight it off. And he would try to go over my head. It was a fun game. There were one or two particular characters, and it was kind of fun matching wits with him. but he was dedicated to the center. And in fact, there's probably 8, 9, even 10 things that were named after him. And our goal was to make this the most important. And by the end, it was. When he passed away, he said, if you have any contributions to make it to the center and SICE. And he would come and he would do Zoom classes, lectures for our students, which was always a treat. We did a world order study group. We had him come visit the center a couple times. And so I am fully aware as a historian that he's a controversial character for many, and I've got thoughts about that. But on an individual level, he was personally incredibly warm. He was hilarious, and he understood that the center had to be independent from him. And I've written things against him. Hal has written things against him. Sergey has written things about him. He read all of it. He knew it. He would sometimes sort of needle us about it. But he ended up being very supportive of it. And so he was extraordinary. And to be honest, I know it's a controversial thing to say, but I actually miss him. You meet a lot of people like this when you're in Washington, as I'm sure you have, and they're rarely what you expect. You read the books and they're sort of disappointing. And Kissinger was Kissinger. He was sharp, smart. He was, I don't know, conniving is not the right word, but he always knew that you were thinking, I'm in the presence of Henry Kissinger. And he was thinking, okay, what can I do with that? Even to his 100th year, he was incredibly sharp and interesting.
Well, Frank, I read his book on leadership, and I was struck by an anecdote he tells in which in 1953, Churchill is encountered by an American exchange student who asks him how to become a statesman. And according to Kissinger, Churchill said to him, study history. In history lie all the secrets of statecraft. Which of course is we'll talk about in just a minute about your book because that's sort of the core of it. But before that, I want to talk just real briefly about your writings for Texas National Security Review because I've been exposed to it through my study of you, and it is an amazingly interesting, lively, provocative publication journal. Tell the world about the Texas National Security Review.
Absolutely. And that's very kind of you to say. So I was at University of Texas for a very long time. And when I ran the Strauss Center, one of the people that I had recruited there was this extraordinary scholar and policymaker named Will Inboden. And it just so happens now that Will is the provost of University of Texas. And after I left, Will took over the Clements Center, and another good friend, Bobby Chesney, who's now dean of the University of Texas Law School, took over the Strauss Center. And around the same time, Admiral McRaven became the chancellor of the University of Texas system. And Bill McRaven basically said to Will and Bobby, I want to sort of support national security, international security at the University of Texas, but one of the things you have to do is to create a journal. So they came to me and I said, oh, starting a journal is a terrible idea. Journals are hard, they're difficult, they're expensive. But we sat down, mostly Will and I, and thought, how do we design a journal that both was scholarly, but engaged, and as you said, was lively. And we did things like we paid our reviewers so that if the person sent in a review or sent in an article, we could review it really, really quick. We had a strategist section where we would have people who were thoughtful policy types who could write for us, but maybe at greater depth and in a more serious way than they would for foreign affairs. And we pulled this all together. In the beginning, the University of Texas system had been very generous. So we reached out to a bunch of senior people, Bob Jervis, Mel Leffler, Hal, and paid them to write for us. But over time, we realized the journal would only succeed if young scholars saw it as a way to advance. And we spent a lot of time. And so, like my dean, Jim Steinberg, who has a storied policy career, he's published 3 or 4 terrific pieces with us. Phil Zellico, people like that. And so we've been very happy with the mix as time has gone on. Different people have moved in and out, but the University of Texas system has been very supportive. They've kept me on as the chair of the board of editors with the idea that I try to provide some kind of intellectual overview in each of the issues. And so I try to balance between the idea that you want scholarly rigor, but you don't want to be obsessed with the disciplines. You want to do serious, in-depth work, but you also want to be mindful of the fact there's a large audience of people out there who really like it, and really want to be informed. So we've had people like Jim Mattis who read it all the time. Or I was just up at Yale and saw John Gaddis, and he said the same things you did. He says it's the first thing he reads every morning. So we feel very happy about it. It takes a lot of work, and there's a great team there. The executive editor is a great scholar named Sheena Greitens. They have a whole team there who do really good work, really good associate editors. I mean, our greatest challenge is finding smart young historians to send good works to us because the problems with the field of history right now. But yeah, no, it's one of my favorite things to do, and I'm, after being initially incredibly skeptical of it, really happy with how it's turned out.
Great. Well, let's talk about thinking historically. And I'm going to read a couple of sentences and then have you expand. You write, a rigorous understanding of the past provides insights and tools that enable better choices in the present. This is especially true in the extraordinarily consequential worlds of statecraft and strategy. And then you go on to say, it may seem obvious that we should employ history to improve decision making, but it's rarely done. History is more often misused, deployed ineffectively, exploited for problematic and even nefarious purposes. Our times favor other ways of knowing the world over historical thinking, and the academic discipline of history has not helped. In recent years, it has de emphasized the history of statecraft and policy in favor of other subjects. So go to town with that, both the premise of your book, which is that a rigorous study of history is not only interesting in its own right, but can help us, navigate the worlds of statecraft and strategy. And then you've made several references to this already about just the kind of the changes and the tumult in the world of the historical um, discipline and how that is sort of shaping your approach to strategy.
Yeah, no, there's a whole bunch of different threads that kind of fed into that. Part of them are personal. So I started as an undergraduate studying international relations and studied with some of the great international relations theorists of our time. Graduated in 1989, 88. In 1989 and 1991 happened. The revolutions in Eastern Europe, fall of communism, the fall of the Soviet Union, and literally nothing I had learned in international relations, it certainly had not predicted it. No one had predicted this to happen, but it didn't even really explain it. And that was kind of a shock to me because here was this epistemology that was held up as the core way of understanding how the world worked. And the most important world history event of my lifetime, this epistemology came up empty. And again, I know that sounds harsh, but that's what I was thinking, certainly as a young person, as a 22, 23-year-old. I want to understand the world. And then I thought, well, how do I understand the world? And I started thinking to myself, well, understanding what past events, what past historical forces led us to this moment. And this got me interested in history. So that's sort of part one. And I would say that, again, I have a lot of friends that are political scientists, but I've often found that their lens and way of understanding the world, causality, agency, perspective, um, uh, was didn't capture the complexity, the contingency, the richness, the perspective that history does. So that was kind of point one. Point two then came when because I had the good fortune of being at public policy schools and through a variety of projects, got to engage with really smart decision makers, whether it was my dean then and dean now, Jim Steinberg, who had been deputy national security advisor and deputy secretary of state. So lots of others, people like Bob Zellick, who had been head of the World Bank, Phil Zellico, Dr. Kissinger himself, that and Will Inbode, my friend who was at the National Security Council and also was a historian, that you started to see as decision makers when they had to make really difficult choices about an unknowable future, that what they leaned upon was similar circumstances in the past when people in their shoes looked to a future and didn't know what was going to happen, were trying to understand a radically uncertain, complex future, and history helped provide them with clues and helped provide them with guidance. So I said, okay, that was the second part of it. And then, so then the third part of it was, as I started to think about how people use history and why, because everyone, it's like saying, I love apple pie or I love motherhood. Everyone says, I love history. But because of the nature of how history operates and the historical sort of enterprise functions, everyone thinks already, they think historically. I'm sure you've had this example, and all my historian friends have had this example, where they go to a party and someone asks what you do, and they just use it as an excuse so they can talk about their view of the past. Because basically, everyone thinks our brains are wired to think in a certain way historically, just very, very poorly. And so everyone thinks they can do it. And what I always compare it to is if you went to the same party and met a heart surgeon, you wouldn't say, well, I've got theories on heart surgery I've been really wanting to try out, or I've got this idea about how to build a plane. Yet to actually think historically well is more difficult than heart surgery. It's more difficult than building, putting a plane in flight. And so why don't we know that? Well, part of it is because history, for its own reasons, has this identity crisis. I talk in the book about how it doesn't know whether it's humanities or social science. When I was at the University of Chicago, it's not true anymore, but there were 4 colleges: physical and biological sciences, social sciences, and humanities. And history was the only discipline where you could take it in the humanities or the social sciences, the only difference being that if you did it in the humanities, you took 2 languages. If you did it in social sciences, you could replace one of those languages with statistics. And that to me reflected the fact that there's an aspect of what we do as historians that is more like the humanities. There's a kind of creative sense to it, but there's also this hope, this aspiration to be like a social science, where the social sciences, of course, try to mirror the sort of values of the physical natural sciences, which you sort of understand replicability, generalizability, to order to sort of generate theories about the world. But history is somewhere in between, right? And to me, that's one of its great benefits. It's in between both, but it makes people uncomfortable, and it makes it very difficult to lay out explicit rules of what it means to think historically. If you go to graduate school to become an accountant, or to become a brain surgeon, or to become to design buildings or bridges, or to become an economist or a political scientist, there's a specified standard curriculum and skills in how you can measure. When I was at MIT, if you were a PhD student, there were anywhere between 6 to 8 required methods courses where you learned how to different tools. If you were to get a PhD in history, more or less is a bit of exaggeration, but everyone takes a 1-year pro seminar class where you do a little microhistory here, a little gender history there, a little analytical here, kind of as if you're going to, just do a little samplers. And then you're thrown out into the world, say, go do history, go pursue history, go to the archives, go learn these languages. And so we don't have a shared epistemology. And again, there are good reasons for that. But this leads to the final thing that because history, for its own particular reasons, doesn't have that cut and paste required, understood curriculum, um, people from the outside say, well, I don't know what this is. And then people on the inside aren't able to explain why it is what it does. And as a discipline, it has allocated its interests and values and resources in ways that to an outsider make little sense often. And for an insider, for reasons that I could go into at length, but I'll spare you, for the last few decades has sidelined the serious study of international politics, of diplomacy, of war and peace, of statecraft and strategy. And so this book is an effort both to be more explicit about what it is history can bring to statecraft and strategy, while also calling out the fact that this natural relationship between those in positions of decision making and those who think historically is a powerful one. And for a variety of reasons that are unfortunate, the discipline of history not only has failed to seize this opportunity, it actively operates against it.
Well, Frank, in your book, you have sort of two fundamental concepts that you introduced. One is the notion of historical sensibility. And I was driving someplace with my wife this weekend, and I was holding forth on historical sensibility, and she was intrigued by the concept. She was underwhelmed by my ability to articulate it very clearly. So I said, I'll let Frank do it. So describe, I mean, it's a temperament, it's a way of looking at the world and discerning the world, but explain how you view the concept of historical sensibility and then the related but separate concept of thinking historically.
Right. I think most historians, the experience of being a historian is to enter another world. It's sort of like we tell young people, if you want to understand yourself and understand your own culture, you need to travel and learn about others. It's the same with what historians do when they travel to different worlds, different time periods, different cultures, different ways of viewing the world. And by doing that, that generates a variety of qualities that I think are beneficial not just to decision making, but also to just being a human being. You develop a toleration of difference. You generate an empathy for the difficulties people face. You acknowledge the unbelievable importance of perspective, where you are and when you are. Making a statement will shape how you think about it. You historicize everything. You understand that concepts that you held as existing at all times, whether it is liberty or capitalism or democracy, or historical periods like the Renaissance or early modern period, that those are created by human beings. They have their own history. They're not plucked out of nature. And it generates in you an ability to look at the world and problems in a way that kind of allows you to see them from a variety of different angles and kind of all the way around. And the best way to think about how powerful this temperament is to think in our own world where humility is certainly not something that is treasured, where we see things in binary ways, where there's the famous story or the famous fable that Isaiah Berlin used based on Leo Tolstoy, based on a Greek philosopher, about the hedgehog and the fox, and that there are people who know things about the world. There's the hedgehogs who know one thing, have one macro theory to explain the world, and the foxes who know lots of different things. And in our world, the hedgehogs are the ones who we listen to. We want certainty about the world. We're drawn to confidence, even cockiness. We like to think our perspective of the world is the one that's right and is universal and true. A historical sensibility sort of complicates that and then makes you see. And what that does is it kind of opens the aperture to understanding the world in ways you couldn't before. And there's a practical element to this too. You know, one of the reasons that Kissinger was so still to this day so popular in China is when he went to China, he didn't lecture them. He didn't say, "Why aren't you more like Americans?" He said, "Tell me how you see the world. Tell me how you understand the past. Tell me what you believe." Right? And so he began then a decades-long program to understand that he realized that China was this distinct civilization that had existed for millennia, that had over 1 billion people, and that saw the world in fundamentally different ways than Americans did. That didn't mean he agreed with it, but by understanding that, he could then say, all right, well, here are the things we're going to disagree with, but here are the things we actually share. What can we negotiate? And how can we make sure with our differences, we navigate them in a way that doesn't lead to disaster, right? And so right off the bat, that sensibility generates a greater, I mean, if the world thought, if had that historical sensibility, I think you would have less of that sense of polarization that we have now, that sense of because someone disagrees with me, they're my enemy, instead of understanding the context of where they are. So that's the sensibility part. But as I thought about it, my reaction was not unlike your wife. People say sensibility, what the hell is a sensibility? Like, what do I do with a sensibility? And I have a story in there, and I've seen this happen before, where let's say the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense wants to meet with you, and you have 15 minutes, and there's two people there, and one is an economist or an IR theorist, and the other is a historian. And the IR theorist comes in, she lays out her theory of the world. Here are the three things, signals you have to look for. 90% of the time, this is what's going to happen. And we know by looking at the past that this theory is true. The historian's sitting there losing their mind because all they can think about is how this person is misusing history, how everything is context, contingency, circumstance, chance. And like in 15 minutes, the person becomes so flummoxed that they're not even able to kind of lay things out. So the thinking historically part was to say, okay, it's fine to have a sensibility, but what are some of the specific skills, the specific insights that this historical sensibility can convert to actual a way of thinking historically? And the way I put it is you can't think historically without a historical sensibility, but you can have a historical sensibility without thinking historically. And um, my book offers some of those skills and says what they are. It's certainly, I wrote it with the idea of starting a conversation, not ending it. Others might have others, but it's to kind of force historians to say, you've got this sensibility, this is wonderful. But if I am right, that this thinking historically is as powerful in epistemology and in many ways more powerful than, say, microeconomics or quantitative analysis or game theory or whatever it is. What is it that it can do for someone who has to make tough choices? And that's the thinking historically part.
Well, Frank, a terrific example you provide in the book is Ben Bernanke during the 2008 financial crisis. Bernanke, of course, was chair of the Federal Reserve. He was also, a distinguished scholar of economic history. So describe how Bernanke's, it seems to me, had both the historical sensibility and also could think historically as he tried to assemble, a policy to a world that is sort of unfolding at breakneck speed.
Yeah, no, we were so fortunate in ways that I don't think we fully understand that Bernanke was chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time. So he had done much of his academic work. And again, when you think about the kind of economists that end up in Fed positions, often they're microeconomists. Even if they're macro, they're very theoretical or quantitatively based. And Bernanke had done economic history, and he had studied what had happened with the financial crisis that began in 1929 and the Federal Reserve's reaction to it. And he noted a variety of things. That one, when the stock market was collapsing and banks were closing, that instead of providing lots of liquidity, they cut off liquidity. And two, they did very little in the way of cooperating with other central banks around the world. So Bernanke realized that he had to flood the system with liquidity and that he had to not only cooperate with other central banks, but in a way that I don't think we fully understood. The Federal Reserve Bank of the United States became the lender of last resort to the world in 2008 and 2009. And again, some of these lessons also were taken into account and explains why the reaction in 2020 was better than it might have otherwise been. And if you're to do the counterfactual of having, say, one of the economists from my alma mater, University of Chicago, in that position at that time, or if you look at some of the European central banks and how they responded, uh, the United States, first of all, through a variety, it's never one person, but Bernanke and his historical knowledge and applying it to the moment. And by the way, recognizing too, one of the things that thinking historically allows you to do is also not be a prisoner of history. He did innovative things that had never been tried that weren't available in 1929 or 1931. And I think with him in that position, you ended up having a steep recession, but not a Great Depression. And if you had looked in December 2008, the numbers were terrible and different policies could have produced much worse outcomes. And then if you compare the outcomes in the United States with other Western advanced economies, the United States did better. And so I think you can definitely tie that. And again, I can imagine other economists without that historical background not having responded in the same way.
Well, Frank, an example you use of history used poorly would be President George W. Bush, after 9/11. I think his undergrad major at Yale was history, and he kind of took pride in the fact that he read lots of history
Yeah.
books. And so after 9/11, he was plunging into the books on Churchill and Munich, but maybe he should have been reading some books on Vietnam and the perils of getting involved in a war far away. Talk about that example as maybe what you're saying, people kind of using history in a facile, sort of glib way, and it actually causes more problems than solutions.
Yeah, this is a great point, and it's one that I wrestle with some friends. So obviously, my friend Will Inboden, who worked in the Bush administration, has written a great piece about the uses of history and saw Bush as a great consumer of it. I see that as problematic. I have another friend, John Buse, a great historian, who was also an advisor to 4 British prime ministers, and he's of the view just get anyone using any history, that's good. And this is one of the things that's challenging, and because Bush did read a lot of history, and but I'll just sort of step back a bit and talk about my own personal experience because it did motivate this book. When I arrived at the University of Texas in the fall of 2000, um, I had been hired because I was hired basically in a fluke. The LBJ library and the LBJ school both are under something called the LBJ Foundation Board. And so they get their money from this foundation board. And in 1999, a person who was running the LBJ library later became a great friend, Harry Middleton, made the decision to release President Johnson's presidential recordings earlier than had been expected. He convinced Lady Bird Johnson to let them out. It caused a great sensation. People loved them. So at the board meeting, you're the head of the LBJ library, you're getting all this attention. They turn to the head of the LBJ school and say, "What are you all doing?" The LBJ school had focused largely on state politics, criminology, housing, public health. They did very, very little in terms of foreign policy, but they decided we got to hire a presidential historian. I'm not a presidential historian, but when you want to get a job, you'll make yourself appear like a president, whatever it takes. I get hired as a presidential historian. I show up at the school. I don't know what to teach, right? And they don't know what I should teach because there's no history classes. So they have a course called policy development. I thought, oh, maybe I'll do that. And I made the decision. The way I would teach the class is I would look at 2 big strands of American foreign policy, one that I'd considered a success and one that was a failure, study them each over 3 or 4 weeks, and then do kind of a simulation with the students. So the policy that was a success was American policy towards West Germany and Germany in the post-World War II period. When you think of what a failure it had been in the war period, it was incredibly difficult, very complicated, particularly with the advent of nuclear weapons. Yet the United States does extraordinary things on this front. What's a failure? Well, American policy in Southeast Asia. Now, just as a side note, one of the things I came to the conclusion doing this is that how difficult policy is. The key of the class was to focus on what Fred Logevall calls the long 1964, the decisions in the fall of 1964 and early 1965 to escalate in Vietnam. And I would have the students look at the documents and then do a role-playing exercise. And by the way, what was the same policy they were deciding at the same time? The same people were constructing America's nuclear nonproliferation policy. And so I would tell the students, arguably the worst policy of the post-World War II period, the worst grand strategy was American policy in Vietnam, absolute catastrophe. And the best policy in the post-war period, America's nuclear nonproliferation policy, because if it asked in 1960, in 2025, there's only going to be 9 nuclear powers. There's less nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have not been used. They would have said, that sounds like utopia. Where do we sign up? And that was the result of particular policies. And I point that out to my students. I point that out now to show that empathy. These people didn't lose 20 IQ points when they went from one meeting to the next. Shows you how hard policy is. So as I was teaching this, I would then have the students do an exercise. Someone would play George Ball, someone would play Bundy, see if they could get different outcomes. And we would wrestle with what they had got wrong about Vietnam. And the main thing it generated was better questions. So I taught it in the fall, and then I taught it again in spring of 2021. And I remember ending the class saying, well, at least we'll never have to worry about this again, right? And this is why historians should not predict the future, because then the United States responds to the horrific 9/11 attacks in the United States with these wars in the Middle East, particularly Afghanistan and Iraq, which I don't think anyone can argue at this point, 20 some odd years later, were grand strategic successes. In fact, arguably, they rival Vietnam for fiascos. And so I don't necessarily think that if you had taken this class, done this exercise, read Fred Logevall's great book, Choosing War, that means you wouldn't have engaged in military action somewhere. But you would have asked different questions. You would have challenged your assumptions. The 9/11 attacks on the United States were a terrible trauma and shock, which, by the way, was what bin Laden was trying to get. And the way we responded to it, that was part of his strategy, right? And so if you could have had a moment to say, all right, and again, maybe this would have been politically impossible. We all remember how fevered things were. But if you had a historian who took from history not just the Churchillian moments that we have to fight them on the land and the sea, but instead to say, all right, what are some of the questions people aren't asking? What are some of the bad things that can result from this? What are our underlying assumptions going in that we think we hope to accomplish? What examples in the past do we have where the United States, with the best of intentions, went into a place, be it the Philippines, be it Vietnam, and thought, we've got overwhelming military power, our cause is just and right, people should on the ground be supporting what we are doing, but it doesn't work out. Again, you can find other examples. People in the Bush administration, it's not just reading the Churchill. They were all reading Tony Judd's Post-War a few years later. That came out in 2006. And there was the remarkable story of America's occupation of Japan and West Germany that was a success. So history doesn't provide clear cut and paste lessons like, oh, you've been attacked on 9/11, don't invade Iraq, which has nothing to do with it. It's not the clear lesson. It's instead to say, are we asking the right questions? Are we challenging our assumptions about the world? One of the things I talk about in the book that comes directly from James Joel is this notion that we all have unspoken assumptions about the world. We navigate the world with assumptions about how the world works that are so deep that we don't even say them. And just being aware of that, and by being aware that, oh, in 100 years from now, people are going to look at your unspoken assumptions in the same way we look at the unspoken assumptions in the United States in the 1850s or in Europe in 1914 as a big problem. What are our unspoken assumptions about the world? And I think if that honest conversation had taken place, there might have been different decisions, or when decisions were going poorly, a greater willingness to say, do the kind of Bayesian updating, challenging, okay, we were wrong about this. What should we do differently? And look, I think right now the United States and the world, but particularly the United States, is in a not particularly great place. And you can mark a lot of the disintegration in trust in institutions and governing um, to some of the post 9/11 poor decisions. And so with a more of a, in the same way that Vietnam led to this incredibly destructive sense that things were going awry. So I don't mean to convey that if you'd had these lessons or if you'd done this exercise, they would have made the right choices, but they would have asked better questions and given themselves a better chance to make better choices. And then when the choices they made turned out not to be good, to reevaluate them, because these are really hard choices. They're all what Henry Kissinger called 51-49. But you want to give yourself the best tools possible to make the best possible choices.
Frank, one of the things you talk about in your book is the importance of people to sort of, as you're saying, challenge assumptions and to think kind of to rethink, what they thought was kind of received wisdom, revisionism. And one example you use, which is not grand political development, but was fun and something I could relate to. Growing up in the day, I was a baseball fan, and sort of the two things I knew for certain was that Babe Ruth hit 714 home runs and Ty Cobb was absolutely evil, steel spikes, racist, awful human being. And it turns out everything I was certain I knew about Ty Cobb is based on a really kind of hack book that shaped our perception of Ty Cobb for decades. Tell the Ty Cobb story if you would.
Sure. And I use that one. We can think, we know as scholars, there's all sorts of things that people believe about the world that turn out upon further research not to be true, or you find other documents. But I use the Ty Cobb story because, like as a kid collecting baseball cards and learning about the great players, that Ty Cobb was a bad guy. It had just been part of the received wisdom that Ty Cobb was this terrible racist. And there had been this book written by this guy, Al Stump, that was a total hack job. And someone had gone in and looked into it and looked at the papers, looked at the history. And it turns out that Ty Cobb was well liked by fellow players, actually had some sensitivity on the question of race, was actually more advanced than many other people, had been, someone who was far more sophisticated. He played hard, but not dirty, and was not a racist. And it was like, and I put that example in because there's lots of different examples, but like you, there's a lot of people who, as 12-year-old boys, were taught this. And it showed that I believe for outsiders, the revisionism thing is really hard to understand, but it's one of the great benefits of history. So the way science often works, and this includes how social scientists often feel about themselves, they look at a problem, they collect evidence, they run experiments, and then they settle the question, and they move on to the next question. Historians go back to the same questions over and over and over again. And that drives people crazy. But to me, that's one of the wonderful things about being a historian. We are obsessed with the origins of the First World War. And it makes sense that we are, because it had such consequences. You think about 10 years ago or 11 years ago during the anniversary, I had to review all the new books that were written about the origins of the First World War. It was wonderful, right? This is why I love Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers. It's not like there was necessarily new evidence, but there's new ways of thinking about it, new ways of putting the evidence together, complicating, challenging our assumptions about things, because those uses of the past are what inform how we think about the present. And we'd love to think that it's written in stone and unchangeable, but what that means is then we look to the present and how we think about the world is set in stone. All my international relations theorists like to think Fritz Fischer was right about German plans for empire and causing the First World War. Well, historians know Fritz Fischer wasn't right. Like he misused some documents, he lied about some things, he had a particular perspective. Reading Fischer tells you more about what West Germany was like in the 1960s than it does about what Europe was like in the summer of 1914. And revisionism, that constantly going back, which drives people crazy, actually is one of the great powers of historical thinking. Because if you challenge your assumptions about the past, it then challenges your assumption about the present and makes you ask better questions. And so the Ty Cobb was the most clear story, but even some things that we accept, like people say, another book on the origins of the First World War, of course, bring them on. That's exactly what we want.
Let's talk. You've developed this historical checklist, about 12 or so questions that people can use to sort of interrogate the past and be, kind of discerning about things. Don't have time to go through all of them, but there's a couple I want to touch on. My favorite one is the notion of horizontal history, and I think for a lot of us, we might read a book on a topic and really get totally focused on the topic and then kind of lose a sense of, so what else is going on? And the example you used of 1964 with the nuclear non-proliferation treaty in Vietnam. But another example, maybe you could develop this one, Frank, is the United States in the 1970s. Because on one level, you can focus on kind of the political economic stagflation, sort of, centrist, unexciting politics with Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter and, the Cold War. And it seems like kind of a dreary, dull time. But then if you widen the lens and look at what's going on in California in the around the same time, it's this whole kind of another way of seeing the world. So talk about maybe broadly the concept of historical history. And then if you could touch on this America in the 1970s, because I think it's really fascinating.
Sure. Absolutely. The horizontal history thing began actually out of my dissertation because I started studying the balance payments deficit that the United States ran after World War II and the solutions that the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administration sought to relieve the deficit. This deficit, they were worried, would create a international monetary crisis that would then lead to something similar to the 1930s because of the fixed exchange rates, and they were worried about the loss of dollar and gold. The solution they came up with was reducing the presence of American troops in Western Europe with their families. And this contradicted my notion of the whole strategy of flexible response. So as I started researching this, I realized there were people who wrote about international monetary relations and American economic policy. There were people who wrote about American and NATO military strategy. There were people who wrote about the politics of the German question, and then there were people who wrote about nuclear issues. And to understand why the United States did or did not do what it did in terms of American balance payments policy, you had to understand how all four of them connected. Balance of payments and money, nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy, which then led to questions of nuclear proliferation, the dynamics behind the German question. And that and then I started working as I was finishing this new book. I was involved in the Miller Center had this tapes project where you would listen to President Kennedy, and he would have 8 or 9 meetings. He'd have one meeting on the balance of payments, another on Berlin, another on, say, the steel strike, another on civil rights, another on say, test ban treaty stuff. And you realize that the way presidents solve these things is they didn't go from everything was connected to everything else. So my experience with the dissertation, realizing that academics had broken this up artificially, then made me realize that if you want to understand how decision making happens, you can't just look at one question. You have to see how it's connected along a string horizontally, not just over time, but over space. That's the horizontal history. And this kind of connected into the California dreaming story because I spent a lot of time in the 1970s, and there's a dilemma with the 1970s. All the things that we think about today that kind of give us our modern world, whether it's our iPhones and Apple computer, whether it's like blockbuster Star Wars like movies, whether it's the fact that you and I can go and drink better American wine and have a better meal at an American restaurant than our parents could in the 1960s when it was surf and turf and some bad Chianti, or whether it's that everybody wears Levi's jeans, or that part of this is when I was growing up, and my dad would show me clips of Henny Youngman. I'm like, he's not funny. Like people became funnier, right? And a whole range of things. The world we live in, I started to recognize as a historian had its birth in a particular time, in a particular place, California in the 1970s. Everything from the container shipping revolution to even, modern pornography in San Fernando Valley and Boogie Nights, or gay rights in the Castro and Harvey Milk, and good food with Chez Panisse and Alice Waters, and Star Wars and the Hollywood blockbuster, Apple Computer, even financing. If you look at sort of venture capital, just all of these different things. And so while I was studying interagency documents in the mid 1970s about what to do about this, that, and the other thing, if I were to say what matters to the world, what was going on in Silicon Valley or Hollywood or San Fernando Valley or Long Beach mattered as much and as many ways more. And that's an important reminder to to my policymaker friends and diplomatic historians that the action often is elsewhere. The outcomes we care about in the world don't always happen at a National Security Council meeting. And so the world we live in today, for better or worse, sometimes for better, human tolerance, incredible technology; for worse, sort of some of the disintegration of social cohesion, some of the challenges with the climate crisis, had more to do with what happened in California in the 1970s than it had to do with what was going on in Moscow, Beijing, or Washington, D.C. So that's the kind of point of that part of the story.
Another one that I really am intrigued by is, why does this matter? The notion of historical proportionality. And I mean, to be contemporary, I was just earlier today was going through the Chronicle of Higher Education, and there were six or seven, at least it seemed to me, major articles related to the killing of Charlie Kirk. How is this going to affect academia going forward and so forth? And, without getting into the controversy of his life, it's not clear to me that when we think back on the world of 2025, the killing of Charlie Kirk is going to be the seismic event that it is now being depicted. I mean, respond to that specifically if you'd like,
Yeah.
or just more broadly, the sense of historical proportionality.
So I agree with you. And it's interesting that you give that example because the example that animated me, I was a second or third year um, in graduate school when the O.J. Simpson, Bronco chase took place, right? And so I think I was out one night with my friends. I think the Knicks were playing the Rockets in the finals, and like we're watching this, and so everyone I knew was obsessed with it, absolutely obsessed with it. Newspapers generated all this attention, and I started thinking to myself how there was an imbalance between what we care about in the present and what has historical weight. And I remember knowing right off the bat that O.J. Simpson is historically irrelevant, right, over the long term. And now that you could be wrong about that. You never know an assassination. You can have, Archduke Fritz Ferdinand, it's an assassination that matters. But of course, in Europe in the previous 15 years, there had been scores of assassinations that didn't have the same consequence. Um, so, and it kind of gets to two of my obsessions. One is historical weight, how in the moment, what you see in a newspaper and online is a not great predictor of what's going to matter over the long run, which gets to the second obsession. How do we better do contemporary history so we can have a better sense of what matters, which is close to impossible, right? It could turn out that Charlie Kirk murder in all sorts of unintended ways does have these consequences or not. I'm with you. My instinct is not. But on the kind of subjects of high policy, how I started thinking about this is I spent a lot of time thinking about the Johnson administration, and the newspapers were filled, as they should have been, with all of this news about Vietnam. But if you look at 1967, the war in the Middle East um, has extraordinary consequences that we're still wrestling with today. And whether it's the occupied territories, whether it's because the whole story behind it is the United States sees the Soviet Union trying to support Egypt and Syria's move in the region. Israel launches a successful preemptive attack, but before 67, the United States had not been fully in with Israel. In fact, in the Kennedy administration, relations have been very bad. And our relationship with Saudi Arabia had not been a kind of an important thing. And our relationships with the Shah of Iran were far worse than people remember, right? And so after that, the United States, because Great Britain, because of the Sterling crisis, again showing horizontal history, has to abandon the region. It had been a British responsibility. The United States couldn't do anything because it was stuck in Vietnam, makes this decision to go all in on Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And that has enormous consequences over the long run. The next year, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty is signed, which, as I suggested earlier, I think is the most successful grand strategic effort the United States had made. If you had told people, people didn't believe you could stop other states from developing these technologies, acquiring these weapons. And here we are 60 years later, and extraordinarily, we have. Um, so it's just to say, when you pick up your newspaper every day, when you go online, and this is particularly true in an age of TikTok and social media where all this stuff is being curated for you, um, odds are the thing that matters most at that moment is going to have less historical weight. That you can be interested in and it can matter, but if you care about policy and you care about things that are going to shape our lives in ways that matter, that generate outcomes that affect people's lives, you want to look at those things that have longer term, broader and deeper consequences. And that was to get the idea of chronological proportionality, just to have in your mind, you don't know necessarily what's going to matter most, but it very well may be the thing that everyone is obsessed with. You should at least question whether it's going to matter or not. I mean, as I talk about in the book, Paris in July of 1914 was obsessed with the Caillou affair. It was this great sex scandal, involved the shooting, extramarital affairs, and like nobody knows what the Caillou affair. But if crisis in the Balkans, see page C14, right? That's how, and just part of thinking historically is to say our current moment, we need to ask deeper and more probing questions about the events in our world today to ask where we should focus our attention and policy effort and concern.
I was reading an essay by Barbara Tuchman about writing history, and she was saying that she found it very, very difficult to write about contemporary events. And she tells the story that she was writing a book, The Bible and the Sword, about the founding of Israel, effectively. And she had spent, I think, like 4 or 5 months on this last chapter that brought the story relatively close to the present day. And she writes, anger, disgust, and a sense of injustice can make some writers eloquent and evoke brilliant polemic, but these emotions stunted and twisted my pen.
Yeah.
How do and you have a sort of a separate theory about chambers of the brain and how to sort of engage, but when there's an issue, a contemporary issue that really, you feel strongly about and provokes strong reaction, do you consciously say, hang on a second, this is just too hot for me to jump into right now?
Yeah, it's so there's two issues there. One is can one do contemporary history? Can one bring the skills that I talk about to the present moment to understand things? And there's a lot of people, a lot of historians who understandably say that can't be done. I had an advisor, Bruce Kuklick, my friend who I've mentioned several times, Will Inbode, they believed you needed to wait 20 or 30 years before you could actually do historical work. One, because the documents probably weren't going to be available. Um, but second, for the reason you just mentioned, that we're so wound up often, like I don't have any emotional engagement with the Council of Trent or the War of Jenkins Ear, right? But I might have an emotional connection to Russia's invasion of Ukraine or something, Trump's speech at the UN yesterday. And so my ability to kind of get historical perspective is going to be really difficult. But I ultimately think you have to do it because you're going to do it anyway. And why not do it with a historical sensibility? The chambers of the brain thing is I wrote something about my thoughts on what happened in the Middle East, and they had been thoughts that had been percolating actually for 30 years. I have long disliked America's policies in the Middle East. I've long thought they needed more thorough interrogation. Years ago, when I was at the Olin Institute, some great colleagues, Darryl Press and Eugene Gulch, wrote a piece called Come Home America, which is one of the foundations for the school of thought, which is called the Restraint School. And they basically said the United States should leave Europe and East Asia. They don't have strategic interest there. Those places are wealthy enough to take care of themselves. Where we should be is the Middle East. And I thought about this, so you have this exactly wrong. Like the Middle East, you know, at that time, even though we needed the energy, I thought because of the consequences for the climate and the fact that there's all these externalities with fossil fuel use, I have no problem if the price of oil is $250 a gallon, it should, or a barrel, it should be, and it should wean us off. But Europe and East Asia, we have profound interest and influences there. And so I thought this 9/11 only accelerated this, the wars in the Middle East only accelerated this. Then we become somehow through the fracking revolution an energy exporter. And I just kept asking myself, why the hell are we in this region, right? Like, and so the horrific Hamas attacks take place. And it's one of those things that I had the same feeling I had after 9/11. Obviously, what Hamas did was evil and despicable in the same way as what Al Qaeda did was evil and despicable. But make sure your response is smart. And I had no doubt, given what I knew of Israel and its grand strategy, that it was going to, instead of think historically and say, and by the way, President Biden tried to remind me of this, hey, we did this after 9/11 and it was not great. Don't do that. You are fully justified to do what you want. And of course, Israel did do that. And so they are in a situation where, like the United States, they won the military battles, but at great long-term grand strategic cost. And again, to my point about the action being in different places where we think it is, when I look at Israel, an amazing country, an amazing democracy, an amazing economy, the most important factor when I look at Israel is demographics, right? So if you look at Israel by current trends, like a lot of advanced economies, most of the people aren't having kids, with two exceptions, the Haridim and Israeli Arabs. And so if by 2050, over 50% of the population of Israel will consist of two groups whose vision of what Israel should be and is, I would argue, at odds with the sort of the great founding uh, vision of Israel. That strikes me as kind of a problem, right? A big challenge, and one that is going to be more of a threat to Israel's long-term success, the Israel we know, than what Hamas is doing. And again, that's a historical sensibility, and I could be wrong about that. You can imagine how people respond when I say that. Demographics is always an important historical factor. It's very difficult for policy to affect it, but it's one of the most important things, right? Like all my friends who think about worry about China. I say, well, if you follow demographic patterns, China's population in 2100 will be half what it is today, which is as if they've gone through the equivalent of several thermonuclear wars. That's going to affect how they view the world. So you should think about that in policy. In history, it's one of the great drivers. So I wrote that piece after 10-7, which was just to list some of the things that I thought. And I used this chambers of the brain thing because I've got two very good friends. They drive me in. They have totally different driving styles. One drives like a madman. The other drives like he's driving Miss Daisy or something. He's like, and they both see how other people drive. They complain it's a reflection of the collapse of civilization. I'm like, it's nothing to do with the collapse of civilization. It's just driving. Like, don't over import lessons into this. De-emotionalize it, right? And again, as my children point out, like, Dad, we've seen you yell when you drive, so this is ridiculous. But observed in the breach. But it's to find a way it's when issues are especially fraught and emotional that we need better analysis, right? It's hard in this moment to offer. And I'll tell you, one of the things I take great pride in those essays you point in Texas National Security Review, there's a great, he's not as young anymore, but he was at the time younger scholar who was he would reach out to me and say, I love your essay. And I'd ask him about him. And he works now at a place called the America First Institute. He's a full Trump person. And he'll be like, I love these essays. And to a certain extent, and I went and I had lunch. I want to understand how you see the world. After the election, I sent him a note. I was like, this is not how I voted. I have concerns, but I know you are happy about this, and that makes me happy. And I know you're a thoughtful person. I hope you're sort of involved in this. I think in this moment, we have an obligation to sort of lower the temperature and to not put it's impossible. We're not robots. We're going to have rooting interests, but to try our best to understand varying perspectives. And I do think thinking historically can do this, and that's the whole chambers of the brain idea.
Great. Frank, two final questions. One, and this is sort of a huge question, but for students who are beginning their careers, and let's say, there's someone in their early 20s, they're interested in being in the policy world, have a real interest in history, really are persuaded by your arguments in kind of a practical way. How do they develop this, historical sensibility, these critical thinking skills? Um, you know, do they just, would you urge them, and let's just posit that they are not inclined to get a graduate degree or PhD. Should they, sort of read thematically and find one subject and just really do a deep dive and kind of understand its many nuances? Should they, find one or two historians they really like and just immerse themselves in him or her? I mean, what would you say to a student either at SAIS or at SIU who wants to bring this historical perspective to their work in the policy world?
It's a great question and a great challenge because most people aren't going to get PhDs in history. Most history departments in their PhD offerings aren't really going to emphasize this stuff. Many of these young people are either going to be in undergraduate programs or, say, professional master's programs or law schools or policy schools. And here and there's curriculum offered, but it's not widespread. And I hadn't really thought about this before you asked it, because when you think about history, there's two different ways of thinking what you get. One is a deep substantive knowledge of a particular subject. I was at a dinner at Yale recently where Arnie Wested had his PhD students there, about 9 or 10 people. And they knew more about particular subjects than anyone in the world. And it was fascinating, just utterly fascinating different things. And so you develop that. But I think for the person who's going to go into statecraft or decision making, they want to say to themselves, it's less the substantive skills, it's more how I go about this problem. So I would say a great example would be, what's the most important international political event of the last century and a half? Probably the First World War and its origins. I have a joke to my IR theorists friends that all IR theory is actually 3 historical questions. Why did the First World War happen? Was Hitler unique? And how do nuclear weapons affect international politics? All of which are historical questions. That's all theories of war and peace are. They don't really have a good answer for me when I say that, but pick one of those three and look at all the different perspectives, right? If you're interested in war and peace, and you can apply this to other subjects too. Maybe you're interested in development. There's a great histories of development, or maybe you're interested in nation building. Take a subject or a question you're interested in and find as many diverse views and interpretations on it. And ask yourself, when you look at these interpretations or these analyses, why are they different? Do they identify different actors, different historical forces? Do they look at it from different perspectives? I talk about this in the book, but imagine you were doing a history of the revolutions in 1989. Imagine how you would interpret it if you were living in Beijing versus Brussels versus Washington versus Moscow, right? And maybe take histories that take those different approaches. Or take a question that's contemporary, like the consequences of NATO expansion. I have more friends. I always feel like it's my example, 6 degrees of separation, because the 19 people who either write about, were involved in, or designed NATO expansion, like 15 of them are friends of mine. And it's a totally obscure question, but it's become politicized because of the war in Ukraine. And everyone argues about it, right? Even though the facts of the case are known. Look at something like that, and instead of taking a view, ask yourself, why do really smart people looking at the same history develop different theories of what's going on, different explanations for what's going on? Why is that? And so I would just say, pick a question that you're interested in, do a deep dive in, less for the substantive facts, which you should know, but more for how do people make arguments about the world. All arguments about the world are in some ways historical, even though it's implicitly or explicitly. We're in a world right now where we don't know what the hell's going on. People are offering lots of explanations for what's going on. How should we evaluate them? Well, one way is, how do they look at how we got from where we were to where we are today? They are, even though they may think they're economists or sociologists or scientists, they're telling stories about how the past came to this present moment and where we're going. So look at histories and see how people make those arguments. What kind of evidence do they use? What evidence do they leave out? What actors do they focus on? What actors do they leave out? You know, if they do say the origins of the First World War, do they just focus on everything from June 28th on? Do they start it with the first Balkan Wars in 1911? Do they go back even earlier to say the wars of German unification? How do they tell the story, right? And ask those kind of questions. And I think then that gives you a sense for how history really informs all that we do, and it informs how we make our choices and decisions.
Really interesting. Final question, Frank. So a scenario, you've been given a 6 month sabbatical by SAIS. Maybe they'll send you to Chicago, University of Chicago. Let's do it in the dead of winter so you're not tempted to go out along the lake shore and have fun. But 6 months to just, and your instruction is read great history. Go for it, have fun, read books that are substantive, well argued, rigorous, enjoy. Where would you go? What would you do?
You told me you were going to ask me this, and it's such a hard question because um, I'd want to read everything. Our house is filled with books, drives my wife crazy when new and new books show up, and I'm actually a slow reader. Uh, but I'll give you a few that if you were, say, someone interested in international politics, that I have found incredibly valuable and insightful. I'm not going to, so William McNeill, who was a historian at the University of Chicago and wrote this book, Pursuit of Power, where he connects technology, demographics, the rise of the state, and war in a way that's absolutely fascinating, and it's big history. I would pair that with Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which also it's more about sort of history in the modern world from the 16th century on, but how the desire of states to expand, build empires, both generates and drives a lot of our domestic institutions, but also creates sort of the rise and fall of powers. Um, I then would, fascinated with the tumultuous period of the early part of the 20th century. Uh, Adam Tooze has this great book called The Deluge, which is about how the world struggled and wrestled with how to think about the consequences of the First World War. And it's very important from an American perspective because the United States had as much power probably in 1919 as it had in, say, 1991, 1992. And what it decided to do or not do with it had enormous consequences. And it's a book that helped me understand the interwar period. Um, to the extent that a person cares about individuals, particular leaders, Stephen Kotkin has written 2-volume biography on Stalin, a third still to come out, which gives you an insight because we all look at someone like Stalin. How does someone like that rise to power? How do they stay in power? How does that work? And if we're trying to understand Russia today, understanding Stalin's important. Steve's a beautiful writer, unbelievable access to sources. Um, I would say another book that had a big influence on me, uh, uh, that Neil Ferguson wrote, called War of the Worlds, War of the World, which is sort of about the history of conflict in the first part of the 20th century. Um, then two of my mentors. Uh, I started out as a Cold War historian. Mark Trachtenberg's book, A Constructed Peace, The Making of the European Settlement, just sort of blew the doors down on how I thought I understood the Cold War. It is still the best book written about the United States, Germany, the nuclear question, and how, after a period of great danger from the late 40s to the early 60s, the United States and the Soviets, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, while they didn't solve, they put on ice the major problems that could have created World War III. And though the Cold War kept going on, the danger of us blowing up the planet went down. And then I also had the great privilege of studying under Walter McDougall, Pulitzer Prize winning historian, who used to teach a class, maybe still teaches a class, I was a TA for it, on the history of American foreign relations since the founding. And he produced a book called Promised Land, Crusader State. It's a thin book, but to me, it is the best book. It captures the themes of what has shaped America's engagement with the world, its contradictions, its tensions, its good side, its less good side since the founding. So I could go on and on and on, but that would be a good start, I think, for a syllabus. And you're talking about that sabbatical. That sounds really good to me. To go off to the University of Chicago and just sit and be left alone to read books, man, that would be heaven.
Okay. Well, if I could write a letter of endorsement, please let me know. I'd be glad to do it. And I
Thank
might add
you.
another book to the list, which is Thinking Historically. Your book really, really is powerful. It's interesting. It's fun. It's inspiring, and I really would encourage students who, are in the heading towards a policy world, but also understand that, the ability to think in historical terms and to have this historical awareness is so critical to read your book, which they can get at Yale University Press, because it really is both, as I said, informative and really delightful. So, Frank, it's been a pleasure to talk. We've been in email touch for a while, and it's great to kind of be able to connect this way. I look forward to keeping in touch, reading your work, and following just the important contributions you continue to make.
Thank you. This has just been wonderful. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm grateful for it.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for watching this conversation. We will have a video of it, which we'll put on our website in the coming days. Please share it with family and friends. I urge you to take a serious look at Frank's book. It's really delightful and important. So thank you for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.